probably the main impetus for.
Yeah. And we always begin our talks with the land acknowledgement. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located. To precede the establishment of York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tukaronga has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I'd like to remind all of the students who are here that if you attend 6 of these lunchtime talks, you are eligible to receive one of our certificates. If you attend 10 or more during the academic year, then you receive the honors certificate. We also have a book draw following each one of our lunchtime talks. So that's another reason you should be signing up. And then I'd like to remind you that we also do a weekly quiz where you get a York Bookstore certificate as well. And I'd like to remind everyone here that McLaughlin College has a traditional holiday luncheon, and that will take place on December the 4th from 12 to 2 p.m. Everyone is welcome. Today we're really honored to have Valerie Jepson here. Valerie is the Integrity Commissioner for the City of Toronto. Prior to that, she was counsel to the Integrity Commissioner for the Province of Ontario. And she's an award-winning counselor or lawyer. The Society of Ontario adjudicators and regulators awarded her a medal last year, 2018. And this year she was acknowledged by the University of Victoria Faculty of Law as being one of their distinguished alumni. She's going to be speaking to the Toronto Office of the Integrity Commissioner. And this all started with a scandal. And I'm not sure if people here remember the computer leasing scandal that took place in the city of Toronto that led to the Bellamy inquiry, which eventually led to the Commissioner's office. So please join me in welcoming Valerie Jepson today.
Vicky.
Thank you, Professor Simeon. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I always love the opportunity to come up here, and I love the opportunity always to talk about the work that I do. I do have a bit of a presentation to go through, but I'm also a pretty informal person, so if at any point you want to put up your hand and ask a question, I'm happy to take those questions. And if you have questions outside the 4 corners of the presentation about my career or the career path or anything to do sort of generally with integrity commissioners or ethics commissioners, then feel free to ask those questions too. And I understand that these topics are pertinent to the issues that you're studying now, so I'm ready for your questions. I don't promise I can answer them all, but I'll give it my best shot. So let me just make sure I've got this. All right. So what I want to talk to you about is I want to tell you, can everybody hear me okay? I want to talk to you about a little bit about city government. So I understand you probably have a good feel or have learned a little bit about ethics and integrity commissioners or those types of offices at the provincial and federal level. So we can talk a little bit about the city government, just to get a feel for that, and in particular talking about Toronto. Then I want to tell you a little bit about why we have an integrity commissioner in Toronto, and as has been mentioned, one of the main reasons, and unfortunately it is often the reason why offices like mine get established, is because there was a scandal. Then I want to tell you a little bit about what is in the standards of conduct for members of council in Toronto. We can talk a little bit about that, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what the day-to-day work of my office is. So before I get started on that, I'll just give you a little bit more detail about my office, just so you kind of know where I'm coming from. So I am the head of a very small office Toronto. There's 2 other people, a legal counsel and an intake officer. We all hold those jobs on a full-time basis, and we provide the services to the City Council of an integrity commissioner. I'm the commissioner. I'm appointed by the City Council for a fixed, non-renewable term. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important. But interestingly, I'm about 8 days away from ending my term. So that's maybe good news for you, because it might mean I have a little bit more to say. But I'll leave that for you to decide. So a new commissioner has been appointed. His name is Jonathan Batty. He's really looking forward to getting started. And we're going to be having a fairly orderly transition, which is really nice for the office, because we really are part of the fabric of the city now, so we can afford to kind of make sure we have seamless transition, and so that all the needs of the city as it relates to my office are going to be met despite the transition. Okay, so let's get started. So, as I'm sure you know, the Toronto City Council has a mayor and 25 members of council. So, used to have 44, now we have 25. And there are also about 1,000 people who serve on the city's agencies, boards, and commissions. So it could include things like community arena boards, or the exhibition place board, or an adjudicative board. So for instance, we have a committee of adjustment at the city, which is a panel of people who are appointed to make decisions about whether if your neighbor wants to renovate their house and exceed some of the bylaw requirements, they can go to that committee to get their consent. So there's a whole range of boards and commissions. One that you might be familiar with up here is the BIA, the Duke Heights BIA. I think that's nearby. There's a few other BIAs that are active around this area, and those are city boards. So all of those people...
Sorry, what is a BIA?
Sorry, thanks. A business improvement area. So Toronto has about 80 business improvement areas, which are made up of businesses in various parts of the city to levy funds from business owners in the area to carry out improvements in the area. So if you're, like I live near the Danforth, so there's a Danforth business improvement area. They put up a lot of flags and signs and sort of streetscaping to make the commercial experience better. So that's the elected and appointed officials. The city also has a public service. So I don't have a bullet on this slide, but there are about 45,000 people that work for the Toronto City Public Service. So that includes people who work for fire department, the police department, all the people that work in public health, all the policy advisors that help the council to do its work, all the people that work in the clerk's office to help the council and the boards run their meetings. So it's a really large enterprise, obviously. It's, depending on how you count it, it's the 3rd or 4th largest government in Canada. We learned this lesson the hard way last year, but the City of Toronto exists because of a provincial law. So the province can change the constitution of the city anytime, and it did that last year when it changed the ward boundaries from 44 to 25. So the act that gives Toronto its power is the City of Toronto Act. For every other municipality in Ontario, it's the Municipal Act, which is a sort of a generic act that provides the powers and sets out the responsibilities of all the councils outside of Toronto. There are 444 municipalities in Ontario. So Toronto has this special act, which came in to force in 2006, and that is interesting. I'll just put a pin in that because I'll come back to that when we talk about the evolution of our office. The other thing that animates the work of the city is its bylaws. So the Toronto City Council, as do all city councils, has a legal authority to introduce bylaws, and the Toronto City Council does this and consolidates those bylaws into its municipal code. And this is where the council speaks to the public service and the public to set out the programs that it is going to administer to carry out the objectives of council. In Toronto, we have a professional public service, which what I mean by that is it's nonpartisan, it doesn't change with the council. And in Toronto, we have a Toronto Public Service bylaw. which reinforces and entrenches that. The province has a Public Service Act, which you might be familiar with. Federally, there's one. So this is a fairly recent innovation at the municipal level to also have an equivalent type of legislation to give the public service guidance about how it's supposed to carry out its work. And it's really an assurance to the council that when receiving advice from the public service, it's going to be provided in a professional manner. A little point on this, in the recent provincial amendments of the prior government, the municipalities are now required to have a policy that sort of helps navigate the relationship between the public service and the council. So in Toronto, we sort of have the Cadillac version of it. We can afford to do that because we're big. But every city now has to have some kind of framework to help the dialogue between the public service and the council. If that's something you're interested in, there's a whole bunch of great writing around it, so I could point you to that. So that's the backdrop of the city. I'll get back to my jurisdiction in a minute. So as we were leading up to Y2K, does anyone know what that means when I say that? Some people not. Okay. So there was a sort of widespread concern that when we went from 1999 to 2000, all the computers across the world would somehow malfunction because of the date change. So there was a lot of purchasing going on for IT, making sure our systems were in those states of good repair. So Toronto was no different, a lot of purchasing going on. And there were a lot of unsavory facts revealed about some of the major contracts that were entered into by the Toronto government to refurbish the IT assets at the city. So the council, there were so many questions about it. There was a criminal investigation, and the concerns were around whether or not the people involved with decision making for the city, and primarily staff, although there were a couple councillors who there were questions raised about, but whether they had too cozy of a relationship with the vendors. So did the people who got the work and the service contract, were they the best ones, or did they get them because they were friends or cozy with the city decision makers? So this obviously is a serious concern, and I would say is a type of thing that really undermines the trust and confidence that the public has in its government decision making. And so there was an outcry about this, and the city called a public inquiry into these circumstances, which began in September of 2002. And the justice who headed the inquiry was named Justice Denise Bellamy. And we're all very grateful that Justice Bellamy was the head of that inquiry, because she seamlessly led the inquiry through its work and has created what I like to talk about as sort of the Bible for accountability officers in the municipal sector. So the inquiry was going on, and I think this is interesting if we take a step back, because at the same time as the inquiry is going on, this is an independent inquiry that's been assigned to review, find out what happened, and make recommendations. But at the same time, there's a municipal election going on, and the people running for office said, "We've had enough. We don't need to wait for the inquiry to tell us what went wrong. We're going to clean up the city." And so all the major mayoral candidates in that election were talking and running on a campaign of restoring ethics and integrity. And so even before the inquiry concluded, which happened after, the city appointed its first integrity commissioner. So my first predecessor, David Mullen. He was appointed in November 2004 without any provincial law that required it or even provided for it, but through its own bylaws, it created this position. So this is interesting, 2004. If you look across the country, many cities across the country are doing this now. So through its own bylaws, the city of Winnipeg has put in place a municipal integrity commissioner. Through its own bylaws, the cities of Calgary and Edmonton have put in place ethics advisors and integrity commissioners. So they're really going back to the future a little bit, and you'll see why it's so different in Ontario in a minute. So the Bellamy report came out in September of 2005. It was two phases, quite a bit of fact finding, and then a third phase, which was called the good government phase, which was really a bit of a novel thing to do at the time for public inquiries, but now fairly commonplace, where there was a review of policy recommendations that could be made. Justice Bellamy made recommendations to the city, but also to the province about changes that could and should be made. So one of the things that the commissioner, that Justice Bellamy recommended, was to put in place an integrity commissioner, to put in place a lobbyist registry, and to hire a lobbyist registrar. The other things that eventually came from that was that the city should have an ombudsman and an auditor general. So we have a full suite of accountability officers at the city, and I'll explain why again in a minute. This report, there's a front cover up there, and it's like I said, the good governance part is really the one that students of this topic should read. It's required reading, I would say, if you're going to write or think about this. It has some of our the most important thinking on the topic. The facts are also very interesting. So this report was sort of widely praised for its readability and kind of intrigue that the pages revealed as you flip through them. So I'll just tantalize you with a few things, like there is a part that talks about a councillor driving into the parkade of City Hall after just going to a bank machine to take out cash, and meeting with a lobbyist there. And the commissioner was not able to find out what happened in that parking lot, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. So, as I said already, there was a criminal investigation. These did not lead to any charges. So, what happened was, Bellamy Inquiry comes out. As you already know, the city's acted proactively by putting in place a commissioner, and that's operating. What we saw next was that, as I already mentioned, 4 of these officers were put in place. You'll see that the lobbyist registrar and the ombudsman came a little later. And that's because when the province amended the law that gives authorities and powers to the City of Toronto, the City of Toronto Act, it said, now you're a big city. It's big, you guys are grown-ups now. You're going to have the same level of accountability as a government like us. So the provincial government in this statute required that the City of Toronto, as the only city in Ontario, have an integrity commissioner, the lobbyist registrar, an ombudsman, and an auditor. So from 2000, came into force in 2007. 2007 until this year, Toronto was the only municipality in Canada that had this requirement. As of March of this year, every city in Ontario now must have an integrity commissioner. It's a very new change. In between 2007 and now, many cities in Ontario did what Toronto did and opted in and said, we want to have an integrity commissioner. The provincial law, the Municipal Act, provided for that, just didn't require it. So we were really lucky in Toronto, or in Ontario, because we have a lot of good examples of long-serving integrity commissioners across the province. But I like to say, I think Toronto, and this is really crediting my predecessors, that we really showed in Toronto that it can work, and what a good and well-functioning integrity commissioner system looks like, and how it can be beneficial. And I can make the case in much greater detail, but if you look at the new changes to the law that came into force earlier this year, you'll see that a lot of the things that were included in the bylaws that created the Integrity Commissioner's Office have been moved into the provincial law. So now, across Ontario, if you're going to have an Integrity Commissioner, and you have to have one, you have to provide the full suite of services that the Toronto Commissioner has always provided. So up until 2019, most of the cities outside of Toronto who had integrity commissioners, those commissioners are really focused on doing investigations. As you're going to see, the work of the Toronto Commissioner has really been focused on giving advice, doing education and outreach, and trying to help elected officials understand the code of conduct so that they would not breach the code of conduct or other rules or policies applicable to them. So fairly recent change, this second bullet. So in 2015, the province amended the laws to bring within the jurisdiction of the Ontario Ombudsman oversight of municipalities. And the question was asked, do the overseers need an oversight officer? And the answer came back, and we can debate about why it's this way, that the Integrity Commissioner, the Lobbyist Registrar, and the Auditor, so that's an error in my slide, the Ombudsman is not part of the Ontario Ombudsman jurisdiction. So they're carved out. It's just the Integrity Commissioner, Lobbyist Registrar, and the Auditor. So people can come to my office and have a matter resolved, and then they can complain about that to the Ontario Ombudsman. And I'm okay with that. I'm an oversight person, so that's an important component of a well-functioning system. So, so as I've already mentioned, I'm not going to go into the details. The City of Toronto Act has fairly specific requirements for what an Integrity Commissioner does in Ontario. And you're going to see in the next part of the presentation kind of what does the work look like. But one of the really important things that we gain from the statute is this requirement that we do our work in an independent manner. So it's just a little phrase in the statute, but we really rely on that part of the statute as a really crucial component of the foundation for our office. So what do I mean by independence? So we must be free to do our job, and when I say we, I mean Integrity Commissioners, Ombudsmen, Lobbyist Registrars, and Auditors. We must be free to do our job without being influenced or having fear of being influenced by City Council, the boards, or city staff, the Toronto Public Service in my case. I have to be able to do my job independently from those influences. And so if you've studied any other institutions like that, you talk about independence when you talk about courts or tribunals, those kinds of decision-making bodies. So what we've done in Toronto to try to enhance the independence that my office has is we put in the bylaw a few things that really protect the independence. And I'll just boil it right down for you. The real thing you worry about in roles like this is that I would make a report, the council doesn't like it, and so they fire me. That would be contrary to any independence principles and to good practice. So what we have in Toronto is, we have, as I've already mentioned, all of the officers, the accountability officers, serve for fixed terms. So that's, for me, it's 5 years. So in that 5 years, I have a security of tenure. They can terminate my employment with the city if there's some cause, like if I'm stealing money or doing something quite egregious. There is a process that can lead to that, but 2/3 of the council would have to be on side, and it would be a public, transparent process. The other thing that protects my independence is that I report directly to council as a whole. So if I make a report about misconduct, it doesn't just go to a couple councillors, it doesn't go to the mayor, it doesn't go to the city manager, it goes to council as a whole. So that the council as a whole is the only body that can deal with my matters. The other thing is the city council rightfully wants to have some control over our offices, because if something went really wrong in our office, they would be the ones holding the bag. So there has to be sort of appropriate measures for the ability of the council to oversee what we're doing. And it's really limited to spending. So we are externally audited, so not by the city auditors, not by council, to make sure that we're following all the purchasing rules and doing all the things that we're supposed to do with the public funds that were allocated. One gray area, and I wrote about this in my last annual report, is that, and this is a problem I think all offices like mine have, is that City Council is the ultimate authority for approving my budget. So the council, I've been asking for the council to enhance the funding for my office for several years, and they have enhanced it a little bit, but not per my request. And I think this is a bit of a slippery slope, because it is the people who are subject to oversight from me that are responsible for approving the budget. So we're exploring different ways in Toronto right now about the budget process to make sure that we're doing it the best way we can to protect the independence of the offices. Because we know for sure, and I think everyone agrees at the city, that the council can't interfere with my findings or replace them or replace me. But obviously, if they cut back the funding, cut the office in half, that will have an impact on the ability of my office to do its job. Yes?
How is it determined who externally audits your office?
So there's a process that's administered by the clerk's office. They do a procurement to select like a regular audit firm for 3 or 4 year term. And then that firm reports through the clerk to council about that audit.
So that's done that's not done through council?
So the council doesn't select the auditor.
Okay.
They delegate that to city staff to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. But you'll see actually this meeting coming up, and I think the agenda will be out tomorrow, there'll be a report in that agenda, which is the report to council about the outcome of this audit for all 4 of our offices. It happens every year. So, and if you're interested in this, last year it got a little heated because there was one councillor who was using the opportunity to review the audit to ask other questions that we believed infringed on our independence. So we as accountability officers wrote a letter to council to express that concern. They were trying to get underlying receipts to figure out who our vendors were, how we were doing our investigations, those kind of things. So there's a bit of a record around that for last year. Never a dull moment in Toronto. Might not be in the news as much as it used to, but okay, so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what are the obligations that members of council have. And at the municipal level, it comes from a number of places. So it's a little bit, I came from the province, I was the council there, and if you're a provincial MPP, you look in one place, it's the Members Integrity Act. That's the rule book. In Toronto, you have to look in a myriad of places, but you have an integrity commissioner to help you out with it. So let's get started with that. So, I'd like to start out by saying, I'm going to talk to you a lot about what the Code of Conduct and the Conflict of Interest Act require, but I as an integrity commissioner have to recognize that there are many different accountabilities that elected officials have. So, the councillors are elected and have a democratic accountability to the people that elected them. Not a quid pro quo, to use a phrase of the day, but it's not like they have to do things in exchange for votes. But they certainly are rightfully concerned about whether they're keeping the confidence of the people who voted them in. So that's a legitimate interest that elected officials have. They also at the city have kind of unique legislative authorities and duties because they are an administrative decision maker when it comes to certain types of decisions. So meaning that the council can affect individual rights. Legislatures can do this occasionally, but the council does it more often. And then there are the legislators, so they set the policies and the procedures for the city to follow. The courts talk about what the role of councillors are, and interesting on this point is this old St. Boniface case, which I won't go into all the details, but the bottom line from the courts is this, that because municipal councillors make administrative decisions, so decisions that affect a person's rights, so what I mean by that is a business might go to council to say, I want to have a permit to do this thing, or I want to build this property in this way, and the council can yay or nay that. If the person whose rights are affected feels they were treated unfairly, or they got the wrong result, they could go to court to seek a judicial review of that. And one of the things that the court would be concerned about is if the decision maker, in that case the council, was acting in a biased way that made it for an unfair decision. So what the courts have said about municipal councils is that they're politicians. They're going to have a bias. They're going to have a point of view. It's not like a court or even a tribunal. But what the courts have said is that councillors can have views and express opinions, but they just can't make those types of decisions with a closed mind, so incapable of being persuaded. Now, that's a hard one to figure out. This is what the court does sometimes, is provide us with these nice sounding phrases that are difficult to apply. So I mention that because as an integrity commissioner, I think it's important to recognize that elected officials have a lot of leeway to do the job they do and the way they do it. They're not just administrators. They run on, a mandate. They could be pro-development. They could be pro-environment. They could be pro-bike lane, they could be anti-bike lane. All those things are things that they run on and that they have a democratic accountability over. We have to be careful that we don't start regulating that in the work that I do or others like me do. But in the making of decisions, what we're really concerned about is making sure that decisions aren't made to benefit someone personally. And at the municipal level, we worry the most about financial benefit. So I'll talk to you about the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act in a minute. This is one component of it. The other part is the Code of Conduct, which has more general obligations like treating people respectfully, not receiving gifts, these things. So these two things work hand in glove to provide councillors with their kind of rules of engagement when it comes to these types of issues. And now in Ontario, after March of this year, all of these obligations are, integrity commissioners are available to provide advice, education, and also to do investigations if allegations of contravention are made. So, the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. So, integrity commissioners have jurisdiction over this act now, but we haven't had it until recently, and it's a really old act. So we've had this law in Ontario since the 1970s, and it applies to every municipality in Ontario. It always has. It also applies to board members. And the bottom line obligation is that you cannot participate in any decision for which you have a pecuniary interest, a fancy way of saying financial interest. So this means from end to end, you cannot use your office as a councillor to do anything to influence an outcome that could impact you financially. The act is very technical because certain interests of others are deemed to be yours. So certain family members' interests are deemed to be the councillors, certain corporate interests that they hold, like you're a director of a corporation, that could be a deemed interest. So it's a very technical act, and members of councils across Ontario got very used to, up until recently, seeking legal advice independently, out of their own dime, about whether or not this act applied to them. At present, and since the beginning, if you believe that a member has contravened this act, you can now come to the Integrity Commissioner, but up until March of this year, you had to go to court. So you had to become a litigant, hire a lawyer, file proceedings, go to court, and make the case. And the court could, in those hearings, order a range of penalties, but it was pretty black and white. If there was a breach, the court was going to order that the seat be vacated. The act was very highly criticized for a number of years. So people don't like that the act is so narrow, that it concerns itself with only financial interests. They also thought it was very inaccessible to the public because it required someone to commence litigation to make a complaint. The other thing that people didn't like about the act was that it was so draconian, that if there's a breach, you're going to be kicked out of the office. So the Cunningham inquiry, which is another major public inquiry that took place in Mississauga, pertaining to Mayor Hazel McCallion and her advocacy for her son's business. I'm happy to answer any questions about that. That inquiry offers a kind of an argument about what are the shortcomings of the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. After the Magder and Ford case, there was more concern about many aspects of the act, but in particular, the draconian nature of it. So the Magder and Ford case was the case that some of you might remember when Mayor Ford, a citizen brought an application to court to say that Mayor Rob Ford had contravened this act when he voted on a decision to reverse a prior decision of council that required him to pay some money back because he breached the code of conduct. The court found that that was a pecuniary interest, the first level court, and so his seat was declared vacant. So we were without Mayor Ford for a few minutes, because then there was a stay application, and that decision was put on hold pending an appeal. The appeal overturn the decision on very, in my opinion, it's not really an opinion, on technical grounds, unrelated to the merits of the issue. They said that the council did not have the role or the legal right in the first place to have ordered Mayor Ford to pay back those things that was reversed by the second decision. It doesn't say this in the decision, but critics have said that you see this type of decision because courts are really not that interested in unseating democratically elected popular mayors from the city. So this is where I think we really do see a tension between a democratic accountability and a deference to the electorate versus this wish that there be some oversight and sort of a black and white ruling that leads to removal. Stay tuned tomorrow because Councillor Kerry Janis is in court. He was a councillor who was removed from office summarily because of an election finance filing issue. And I don't have anything to do with that case. What I'm about to say is based on the news only. But one of the things he's going to be arguing is that he's got some arguments to make about the suitability of it. But I do think we're going to have to see the court wrestle with whether this arguably draconian consequence is suitable for what happened, when what they're weighing is, the right of the people in his ward to pick who they want to represent them. We just had the election. So stay tuned for that. Yes?
For students who are interested, the hearing is open to the public. It's at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. If any of you are looking at going to law or into politics, I'm actually, so my duties at U of T, I'm supposed to be at a thing every Thursday at 12 o'clock. I don't know I'm not going tomorrow because I'm going to be in the courtroom. It's that good of a case. So 10 a.m. downtown, 351 University in the civil section. Just look for all the reporters. Go in. It's going to be well worth your time because all that she's talking about, you're going to have some of the smartest lawyers and a really smart judge going back and forth for a couple hours on it.
Who's the judge?
We don't know who it'll be, but generally speaking, these types of things, the Chief Justice or the Associate Chief Justice of Ontario usually assigns, and there's 5 of them that are really good in this area.
Yeah, that's it's good timing, and I think it will be undoubtedly interesting. It will be interesting to see how the court reacts to it and what the reasons are. Because they did, for the lawyers or people who want to be lawyers in the room, this is really going to call on the court to turn to the equities. Like, we understand what the law says, we get it, but is it really right? That's, I think, what the court's going to be asked to weigh in on. So, okay, so that's the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. I think I got my slides a little out of order, so let me first go. I want to tell you about the code, and then we'll talk about the benefits. So, again, hand in glove with the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act now, which is great, is the Code of Conduct. So, in Toronto, we have a very lengthy Code of Conduct, which has nothing in it that would surprise you. It has all the things you'd expect to see. That we have a code because we want to improve the quality of public administration. We want to encourage high standards of conduct. We want our members to act conscientiously, diligently, to act with integrity. Everything you'd expect to see is in there. One big thing I like to say about the code is it's very easy for people who are subject to the code to get their back up, because you're going to see it has things like you can't take a gift from a stakeholder to the city, and you can't use your title to do certain things, or you can't use your influence to do certain things. And sometimes I'll hear an elected official say to me, like, listen, Commissioner Jepson, if you think I would be bribed by a cup of coffee, you got another thing coming. That's the kind of defense I might hear. And what I say to that is 2 things. One is, you're missing the point. So the Code of Conduct and the rules that we have are not there to act as any sort of personal moral compass or guide about personal integrity. The integrity that we're talking about in the code, and why we have an integrity commissioner, is because we're concerned about protecting and enhancing the integrity of decision making at the City of Toronto. And what we have to recognize is that the people who do the work for the city, and I include myself in that category, that our actions, no matter what we intend, are going to impact on what people think about the city. So we have to adjust our behavior so that what we're doing is promoting trust and confidence and not detracting from it. So that's why I like to say it's not personal. But it's really easy because we're all human beings to get our back up when we talk about this kind of thing. The other thing is, this is something that came to me fairly recently, and I know it's not a novel idea, but we do need to sweat the small stuff in this field, because what we're trying to do is to build up a culture and a context where you can say no to a cup of coffee from a stakeholder, and you get good at that. So that when it gets really hard, like, can I fly you on my private jet to this meeting, Prime Minister, you're going to be able to say no. So you have to start right at the beginning to make sure that you're building up the culture that we want to have. So that's why we're not sweating the small stuff. We're actually building a culture. And these small decisions matter. And why it matters is that we can all read the code. You guys can read it. You'll be able to tell me about it better than I can. But what's hard about these issues is doing the right thing in the moment. So are you prepared to answer the question the right way? Because we're human beings. So it's uncomfortable refusing gifts. It feels bad. But when you're a public official, you have to be able to do that sometimes. And so you have to practice. You have to be able to be confident that you can deal with it. And so that's why we talk about things that we do in the code. Our code contains, as I already said, some pretty unsurprising things. Members of council can't use their office the influence of their office improperly, benefit friends, family, themselves personally. They have to follow the rules at council. They have to keep their campaign activities separate from their city activities. They have to protect confidential information. They have to treat the staff that serve the city properly and respectfully without bullying them or harassing them. They have to treat each other that way too. But sometimes I give a little more leeway because they're all at it. So it's not the same as working in a regular workplace. They there's very rare reasons to receive gifts or benefits as a public official. And public officials in Toronto have to uphold the lobbying bylaw. So they can't have their head in the sand about those obligations. They need to be promoting it. I like to say that the benefits of having a commissioner are that, and this I can answer more questions about, is that we need a commissioner because not all the answers to all these questions are that obvious. If it was, we would just have a code and we'd leave it up to everyone to decide. But we have to acknowledge that there are gray areas and that we need a resource to be able to deal with that. So it really bothers me sometimes when the public or the media are highly critical of elected officials for even having to ask a question about compliance with the code. That presumes that they come to office knowing all the answers on these issues, and that's not fair. They're human beings just like you and me, and they need resources and support to be able to answer these questions because they might be coming from the private sector. They may have worked in the not-for-profit sector. They may not have worked anywhere, and they're coming to work for the public, and they're carrying out the public trust. So we should be helping them to understand what their obligations are. In Toronto, there's a bit of an incentive to seek advice because if you do and you follow the advice, you're going to be protected later on if there's a complaint. It's also a way for council to express to the public its commitment to doing its work properly. And there's a fairness issue too, because when people are accused of contravening the code, they want to be treated fairly. And I hope that the process in Toronto provides that. So just a real snapshot of what we do kind of on a day-to-day basis. So we do education, we provide policy consultation to City Council, we provide advice. So anyone at the city who's a board member or councillor can come to me and seek advice. I got one on my way down here. I answered it back on the subway. So you can try to turn the advice around pretty quickly. We do investigations. I'll show you some statistics in a minute. And we provide a report to council about all of our work on an annual basis. We don't do criminal code investigations. We don't do investigations about unpopular political decisions or what we call in our office ward matters, which is a bit jargon, but we actually get quite a few complaints from people saying, I really don't like the way my councillor voted on this matter, or I don't really like the way they treat me when I go to the office, and they didn't return my call till only 2 days later. These types of things we don't get involved with. and we remind the requester that that's really a matter of democratic accountability. That's not always obvious, but that's one a surprisingly high number of people make those types of complaints. We also don't deal with municipal freedom of information, protection of privacy complaints. So we don't get flooded with formal complaints in Toronto. This number has actually been fairly constant. It was a bit lower last year. It was an election year, so there's a blackout period. But we usually get between 16 to 24 complaints a year. The number might be a bit higher this year because the procedures have been relaxed a bit, so we are getting a few more. But all those cases are reviewed, and only the ones that possibly give rise to a breach will be investigated. And so as you can see, the reports to council number is pretty low on any given year. Those would be the cases where the breach was substantiated. What we do more of is provide advice. So these numbers at the top line are interesting because when we had a 45-member council, it showed, most of the Toronto City councillors are coming to the office to seek advice. We're actually, I can say, we're close to 25 this year. So most of the Toronto City councils are coming for advice. Last year we gave 196 pieces of advice to members of council and local boards. And of the about 100 boards in Toronto, it was usually between 18 to 20 of those boards that members of those boards come and seek advice from our office. I'd really like to get that last number up, and we've had some success during my term because we had a bit more resources. So we didn't used to even come close to this 5 or 6 years ago, but we're getting better every year on that front. We also get lots of calls from the public. Last year was a high again year because it was an election year, we think. We don't get as many media calls as you might think, but it is one of the higher ones. We provide resources, so if you haven't been on the website of my office, I welcome you to check it out. We have interpretation bulletins. We got a really great new resources which you'd find under sample advice, which kind of is from the beginning of time of the office, a searchable database of all of the advice, anonymized advice and cases that have been issued based on a certified article number in the code. So I'm really proud that we're able to offer these types of resources to the public and to elected officials. So I will make sure you can get a copy of this so you have some easy reference links to some of the resources, but I know you'd all be able to find it pretty quickly. I encourage you to follow the office's Twitter account and keep an eye on the office because it's going to be exciting times the next few months as we onboard a new commissioner. So I'd be happy to answer any questions about this or any of other general topics about integrity commissions or ethics commissions in general. Yes?
I would think a very important benefit is that your office and those other related offices that you talk about, they reduce corruption. And that's, of course, very important because that ultimately saves money to the taxpayer. About roughly how much money do you estimate is saved each year? Is it $1 million, $10 million, $100 million? How much, roughly?
Well, I wish I could give you an answer to that because that would be the first line in my budget proposal to City Council. And the auditor does quantify the savings that her office provides the city. I haven't attempted to do it. I can talk about it in general terms. So I agree with you completely that the existence of our office and the fact that there's activity under the mandate is a huge disincentive, or creates a disincentive for elected officials to act corruptly because they know there's oversight. And in my view, it's impossible to measure that. One way I have heard it measured in other contexts is in the Mississauga case, for example, that inquiry cost a couple of $1 million. And if they had had an integrity commissioner, then the city would have saved itself some money by not having to have that big inquiry. So it's a little bit of value gained by having a smaller contribution ongoing.
Well, could I play devil's advocate?
Sure.
I like what you do and I think highly of you and your office, etc. But suppose there's a politician who says, having these 4 offices, this costs us, I'm guessing, that's probably several $1 million a year, maybe even $10 million a year. Over 20 years, that's $200 million. That's probably far in excess of the few $1 million you just mentioned was squandered in Mississauga. So therefore, we don't have a net saving to the taxpayer. How do you respond?
Yeah, so that's a question that does in fact get asked from time to time by Toronto councillors too when considering the budgets of the offices. But what I say to that is that the goals and the issues that we have at stake and that what we're trying to achieve with, particularly with my office, are to try to address a fairly intangible thing, which is to promote trust and confidence in the decision making of the city. And there isn't we can always try to measure it by money, but in my view, it's just not an effective measurement for those types of concepts. What I've seen, and what I'd like to see more of, is whether we could gauge what is the public opinion about trust. You know, I know if we look at any survey that's ever done recently, there's going to be a pretty high level of cynicism about the trust and confidence that Canadians have in all levels of government. And I would think that would be a more meaningful metric to try to gauge the value of offices like mine. But it's always going to be an issue, and we see it across Ontario because a lot of the time, and especially before the mandatory requirement, you know, you'd be reading about an action, you know, an integrity commissioner released a report in some municipality, and the second sentence in the story is how much it cost. And so it's an absolutely a proper question and a fair consideration, and I don't have a great money-based answer for it.
So I'm familiar with your role. It's a bit unique amongst the officers because you have the ability to issue penalty. And
well,
thus,
I have the ability to recommend. It's council that imposes the penalty in Toronto. Hamilton's a bit different.
you're correct. You're actually correct that you're correct. The actual act does say that, and the courts have ruled it's ultimately council's decision. They cannot delegate that authority even in the municipal act. So thank you. But nonetheless, when you make those recommendations, you're doing so as a quasi-judicial official in administrative law. You have a law degree, so I'm leading you to an explanation about, you said that people can appeal to the Ontario Ombudsman, but in the case where you recommend a sanction in an investigation, they also have the option of going to the divisional court.
Correct.
Could you explain a little bit about that unique part of your role where you exercise the authority of law?
Sure. Yeah. So, especially when I'm doing investigations, I am a statutory decision maker, and so I'm bound by the common law. I'm not bound by the Statutory Power Procedure Act, as you might know, but I'm bound by the common law to carry out those inquiries in a procedurally fair manner. So this has a variety, places a variety of obligations on me to make sure that I'm being fair to the possible person who might be penalized and potentially to other people, which it means giving proper notice to people who might be subject to penalties, etc. There have been challenges of integrity commissioner reports. So a report going to council, making a finding, recommending a penalty, leaving the decision of penalty to council. Even that report can be, an application for judicial review can be made. So there have been a couple of times in Ontario when that's happened. One, there was a start and then it stopped. Councillor Manueliti filed that in 2014 about one case relating to him in our office. And then in Vaughan, Councillor DiBiase filed a judicial review application about an integrity commissioner investigation and the council decision to impose a penalty. And the court, his main argument was that he wasn't treated fairly in accordance with the procedural fairness obligations, and the court rejected that argument for a variety of reasons. So this is, in fact, it's a badge of our independence because sometimes we get into a bit of quarrel with council about what their role is in overseeing me. So I have been to council where I made a report and some of the councillors don't agree with the finding, and they don't have to agree. But it's not their role, unlike other city staff, where they kind of supervise me and can replace my decision. They have to live with the decision in my case, and they could go to court and get a judicial review of it, but they can't replace the decision, even though they do try to do that sometimes. So this is an issue that I've seen bubbling up across Ontario a bit more lately, and I wrote about it at length in my annual report last year.
Earlier in your presentation, you said that in your office, there's lawyers in your office, correct?
One, yeah.
There's a lawyer in your office.
Yeah.
When city councilors come looking for advice, are they able to speak to this lawyer?
Well, so no, they speak to me,
Right.
or they could speak to someone in my office. The advice that comes from my office comes from the integrity commissioner, not from a lawyer, because the lawyer working in my office is the lawyer for the integrity commissioner, not for the councillor.
So they can't go and seek their own advice from the lawyer in your office?
They could go to another lawyer, but
Right.
not to my lawyer.
Because that would create a conflict of interest.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
That's what
No,
I was
I would be informing myself, like I happen to be a lawyer, but I would be informing myself with legal advice before I made my decision or provided my advice to a member of council. But it is an evolution because many members of council across Ontario are quite used to, and I could say maybe prefer, to be able to seek their own legal advice because they get the benefit of having privileged communication with their advisor. They can do, they can show that they did what they were required to do and follow that advice. They come to my office or any integrity commissioner's office, they're probably going to get, we're going to give them the best advice that meets the obligations, but integrity commissioners, unlike a counselor's private lawyer, are going to have broader considerations that come to bear on the advice.
Thank you.
Yes.
Your predecessor gave a talk to students here a few years ago, Janet Leeper, and one of the questions that she was asked was she, of course, had to write reports with regard to Rob Ford, which was very, very difficult. And so she was asked, well, how do you deal with counselors who have difficulty understanding what a conflict of interest is? Without me missing a beat, she said, you got to love them. And she said eventually she was convinced that Rob Ford understood what a conflict of interest was. So do you have a strategy for dealing with those kinds of issues where counselors really have difficulty understanding a conflict of interest or why it's wrong?
I love that was Janet's answer. She's been such a great role model to me, and that would absolutely be her approach. I do think in doing this role, you have to have a lot of patience, and you have to be, this is a bit of the beauty of the 5 years, because I have to cultivate trust with the counselors, because I want them to follow the advice and I want them to seek the advice. That's no problem if I don't have a complaint about them. I can go out there and do what I can to make sure they have trust and confidence in me, and that they are going to see me in my office as a trusted advisor. What I've tried to do is something that you will be familiar with, Ian, is to try to have in-person meetings with counselors. Because I think these days, and this is probably not a unique to the city, everything's done by email. And it's not a really great way to build up trust or rapport with the people that you're advising. So I, often referencing your work, Ian, have made it my business to meet at least annually with members of council so that they could meet me. And what I found is that members of council, they actually have a ton of questions, but for a couple of reasons, they're not going to pick up the phone. One is they're just too busy. Two, until it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, they're not going to concern themselves with it. So the beauty of the meetings is it gives them an opportunity to ask the questions informally about little things that they kind of have been saving up for the year. And we have some pretty good conversations. So that's been my strategy, is to try to have a more routine, I don't go out for drinks or dinner or that kind of report, but like in a professional way, have a regular face-to-face meeting with the elected officials. That's been my approach. And you do build up a bit of a rapport. But it's the beauty of the 5 years, because now, Jonathan, Commissioner Batty, they're all going to get the benefit of completely fresh perspective, for good and bad, because, a lot of councillors, I really believe in Toronto, it's a real culture of advice seeking, and most of the councillors there want to do the right thing. And maybe I'm giving them too much of the benefit of the doubt now, because I have built up that rapport. But he'll come in with a fresh perspective. A couple more. Who gets to go first? Let's go here.
What is the most common breach in the code of conduct?
I think in Toronto, unfortunately, it's about like discreditable conduct or bullying, harassing, kind of inappropriate behavior to staff, or to the public, and this would be including cases about board members and councillors. So I think if you added up the cases, that's probably where you'd find the most number of types of breaches. But we have had, you know, the biggest cases we've had, the most notable ones have been about improper use of influence. So this was one of the ones that Commissioner Leeper wrote about former Mayor Ford when he's fundraising for the private football club using his letterhead. I've written a couple of cases about improper use of influence, helping friends across the city try to advance issues. So those are probably the more notable cases. We haven't had any yet in Toronto under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. We haven't had any integrity commissioner made complaints about that yet. So those I think will be very interesting when we do eventually get them. There's a couple across the province now. I know of one in Elliott Lake and, or there's two in Elliott Lake actually. So it is the conduct stuff is, and the interesting thing about that is provincial and federal commissioners do not deal with that type of thing. They really only deal with conflict of interest, gifts, those sorts of things. They just don't get involved in sort of behavior. That was a bit of an adjustment for me coming here, but because at the provincial and federal levels, the political parties end up dealing with those types of things. And as you know, in municipal government, there are no political parties. So there are 25 points of view, 25 parties, so to speak. And so the commissioner does have a real role to play sometimes in helping to be a resource or a remedy for people who feel that they've been treated improperly, especially when it's about city staff. That's something that our office has taken quite seriously.
We talked a bit about the value of the integrity commissioners and so on and the other officers. Would a fair gauge of the value be the number of scandals that may be occurring now
Could be, yeah.
versus what they prior to the establishment of these bodies?
It could be, yeah. I always shied away from that one because I like you've heard me say, I have a very optimistic view, and I think that there's a lot of things working, but I'm not, you know, there could be a big scandal tomorrow. I wouldn't want to put all my eggs in that measurement basket if that's what happened, and it could very well. So, yeah.
So if I can put my, I'll call it student hat, officially at U of T, I'm a fellow at large, but de facto I'm a student in a certain way. So I have some law courses I'm taking right now.
Great.
And my one prof thinks I should go into law after my term paper.
Okay.
And thus, I look at your career path. You went to law school. When you went to law school, did you see this path that you're on? If yes, then how did you get there? And if not, how did you get there? And what led you to it? And that's for the students here that might be thinking about this as a career as well.
That's a great question. I really appreciate it because I did not even know about integrity commissioners when I was in law school or in political science before that. I didn't even really know about it until about a couple months before I worked in one. So I was a lawyer. I was in the private sector. About 6 years into my career, I was like, I really like this work, but I'm not really finding some greater fulfillment in what I'm doing every day. So I wanted to get more involved in the public sector. And then I saw this job posted as the Ontario Integrity Commissioner, and like I just admitted, I didn't even know it existed. And it really meshed nicely with my education and my background and my interests, because I'm a political junkie, always have been. And I thought, wow, wouldn't that be neat to work in an office that actually gets to help elected officials do their job better, which is how I saw it. And I put my name in the hat, and I ended up getting it, and it changed my life, because it changed the course of my career for the next 12 years, which is now. And it's been amazing. When I started, there were probably 1 or 2 other lawyers I knew about in Canada doing this work. Now there's probably 15, 20. If you looked at all across the country at all the different commissions. There are a lot of lawyers in the private bar doing this kind of work. In the States, there's a whole practice of law called political law, which talks about election finance and the type of stuff we're talking about, lobbying. That's a growing field in Canada. So it's really, there's never been a better time for people who are interested in this type of work, be it as a lawyer, policy advisor, analyst, investigator. There really is a high demand for doing this type of work. And I would encourage it. It's a really fulfilling area to work in. I am going to be taking a little bit of a break from it. I'm going to be going to work with the Information and Privacy Commissioner as an adjudicator starting in January for 12 months. But I predict I'll probably end up back in this field at some point. But I've always really enjoyed it, and especially if you're interested in administrative law, it's a nice cousin of it. What's the question back?
Yeah. Well, the Office of the Integrity Commissioner and Conflict of Interest Officer has been around for a while now. In some municipalities, there is a one-term appointment condition placed upon. I believe that's true in the city of Toronto. So do you see this morphing into a career? So we have career integrity commissioners? And if so, do you think that would be a good thing? What are the pros and cons of that happening, if it is likely to happen?
So that's a great question. In terms of being that integrity commissioner, I think there are different considerations than what I just talked about. Because I do think, like in my case, I've served under a commissioner, and then I've been the commissioner, and I've been the commissioner at the city, which I think arguably is a bit more in the fray, although maybe not lately. Provincially, there's quite a bit of attention being paid there. But I do think you do need a term time limit to do those jobs. Because you need to bring a lot of energy to it. And I see it with Jonathan. He's really excited to get started. He's got a great energy. I have that energy. I still have a lot of energy, but I know I had more at the beginning. And I think that's really great for the office. But it's also a hard job. It's lonely. You're the fun police. You're not always everybody's favorite person. My recent joke is like when I'm at City Hall now, I feel like I now really know what the meaning of being the skunk at the garden party is. So, if you're a person that really likes being part of a team, and it's not, you couldn't do this job for a long time. So, but I also think as long as the person has a background in it, I don't think you can come and just parachute in and just do it as a matter of first principle. I do think you need some background in it, but I do think a fresh perspective is helpful, and I think it's what the elected officials deserve. Because things do change, values change, and I think new perspective is really what they should be able to have in providing the advice and making the calls on the cases.
Is there not some inherent, I keep coming back to conflict of interest,
Yes.
but it's just stuck in my brain.
Yes.
Is there not some inherent conflict of interest with the city councilor coming to you to discuss something, and then later you might recommend an action be taken? Surely they can get their own counsel and speak to them beforehand and then have that, privileged communication. But is there not some conflict of interest that exists there?
Absolutely, a great question. So I'll answer that, but let me tell you first, in Calgary and Edmonton, it's why they've created two offices. So there's an advisor and an integrity commissioner. The advisor provides the advice, and the commissioner does investigations if necessary, because they were concerned about this. When I first joined the provincial office, I was concerned about it too, because it's the same model. It's the same person who gives the advice and does the investigations. What I've come to learn and embrace is that it is a kind of a unique type of tribunal where we can do both things. Now, can we do that in every case? No. I was quite worried about it in Toronto, because I thought members of the public can make complaints in Toronto. We get way more complaints than the province does. I thought it was only a matter of time before a councillor, never mind a conflict, wouldn't want to get advice from me because they've been the subject of an inquiry. I found, actually, to the contrary, that councillors actually don't mind it, as long as they feel like they were fairly treated in the inquiry. So that's been one revelation. But certainly, if there was a case, let me back up. The other thing is that councillors want to be able to rely on the advice. So they like the notion that they can come and get the advice, and if there's a subsequent complaint, the commissioner will be bound by that. So that there won't be another person that they're going to have to convince about that issue. And I think that's appropriate in these gray area issues that we're talking about. Having said that, there could be a case, I haven't encountered this, but where it's just not possible for that person who gave the advice for whatever reason. Maybe there's a debate about what the councillor told the commissioner, maybe there's a factual issue there, where it's just not possible for the commissioner to do it. because of a conflict. And so the commissioner could then delegate someone to do that. And we have that authority under the City of Toronto Act.
Thank you.
We also have conflicts in life too. Like, we could have conflicts because of our spouse's employment, or like, there's all kinds of other reasons why a commissioner too can have a conflict.
So question, so does your office provide or exercise, I guess, client privileges? So, if a counselor comes in and seeking advice about something you did, but you end up not exercising your advice, but you are well aware of something that they have committed, are you obliged to report it? Or do you exercise client privileges, confidentiality, and you don't?
It's a great question. So we don't have a privilege in the sense of legal privilege, that we don't have. But what's interesting is, I didn't get into this, but my office doesn't, and no integrity commissioner has the authority to commence an inquiry without a complaint. So using your example, someone comes and tells me something they don't follow. If I'm the only one that knows that, there won't be a complaint. I can't do anything about it, which can be frustrating, but that's the way it is, and that's the way it is on purpose. And what I mean by that is, when the province amended the law in 2018, the first draft of the bill included the right of commissioners to do an own motion inquiry, to be able to commence an inquiry based on information they had. And this was removed from the law. So I think if we had all the money in the world and we wanted to have ethics advisors and inquiry, and we could do that. But for the way the system works now, a counselor wouldn't have to worry about that now. It's a different kettle of fish if what they were disclosing or what I thought happened was a criminal thing, or there was some harm or safety risk. Then I, as a public office holder, would have to exercise my ethical obligations to deal with that properly.
Well, Valerie, thank you so much for your presentation and giving us the historical background as well as the challenges and the issues that confront your office. And congratulations on your term of office, and best of luck in your new responsibilities.
Thank you very much. I brought some little info cards, just if you want somebody to take away. They're on the table. They were great.